Grace Calloway stared at the large ranch before her, the snowflakes swirling around her like tiny shards of ice. It was late afternoon, the sun setting low behind the snow-capped mountains, casting a long shadow over the ranch. In her arms, she held her daughter Lily, a small bundle of warmth in the cold, her silence hanging between them like an unspoken fear. Grace had nothing left. No husband, no home, and no means to survive the bitter Montana winter closing in. The last of her money was a mere 23 cents. With a deep breath, she stepped toward the ranch house. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. It creaked open slowly, revealing a man who appeared as weathered as the land around them. His face was hard, eyes narrowed in suspicion. "We don't want whatever you're selling," he said gruffly, his voice carrying the weight of years of solitude. Grace swallowed the lump in her throat, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can cook, clean, work harder than any hand you have. I just need a roof over our heads and meals to get through the winter. Please." The man's eyes softened slightly, but doubt remained etched on his face. "What's the catch?" he asked, his gaze flickering to Lily's pale face, her eyes vacant, lost in her own silent grief. "Just don't let my daughter die in the snow," Grace said, her voice raw, desperate. She could feel the chill of the winter creeping closer, each snowflake a reminder of a life she had lost and the one she needed to protect. Jack Thornton studied the woman before him. She was young, no more than 25, but the weight of tragedy hung heavily on her slender shoulders. The house was silent behind him, as if the walls themselves had been mourning for months. The thought of taking in another mouth to feed, especially someone with a child, was a difficult one. But there was something about her plea, the rawness in her voice, that broke through the hard shell he had built around himself after his wife's death. "I'll give you 2 weeks. Barn only. No funny business or you're out." His words were firm, his tone leaving no room for argument. He wasn't looking for trouble. He didn't want the complications. But something deep down stirred in him, something that told him this woman wasn't like the others who had come and gone. She was different. Grace's face softened with relief, and she nodded quickly, almost too quickly. She didn't ask for more, only for a chance to survive. Jack stepped aside, and Grace walked into the small, dimly lit house. She carried only one bag, a small leather satchel that seemed to hold everything that was left of her life. Lily clung to her mother, her small fingers gripping the fabric of Grace's worn coat. As Grace unpacked, she spoke to Lily, her voice gentle. "We need gently but firm, teaching it to be bread," she murmured, her hands moving as she set up a small fire in the stove, a task she had done thousands of times before. But this time, the warmth from the fire felt like a promise, a small, fragile one, but a promise nonetheless. For the first time in months, the house felt alive. The smell of freshly baked bread and brewing coffee filled the space. Jack had been living in this cold, silent house for over a year since his wife, Rebecca, had died during childbirth, and the emptiness of the place was a constant reminder of a life he had lost. But something about Grace and Lily's presence made the place feel less like a tomb and more like a home. As Grace worked, she spoke softly to Lily, her words flowing freely, almost as if she were trying to fill the silence that had been so present for so long. "Thomas was gentle, but terrible at farming," she said with a slight smile, her fingers moving over the bread dough, "but he tried so hard." Lily's eyes flickered for a moment, as if she recognized the name, and she nodded, though she still didn't speak. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Grace worked tirelessly, proving herself worthy of Jack's reluctant trust. She mended shirts, cleaned the barn, and organized the house. Each small task she completed felt like a victory, a step closer to the life she had once known. But it was Lily who seemed to make the biggest impression. She had been silent for months, ever since her brother Samuel had died. The little girl had lost everything: her father, her brother, and now her hope. But something about Jack's horse made her smile for the first time in a long while. She petted gently, and the horse, usually skittish around strangers, allowed her touch without flinching. Jack watched them from a distance, his heart heavy. He didn't know why Lily had such an effect on him, but the sight of her petting the horse, the way she had a quiet way with animals, reminded him of Rebecca. Maybe that's why he let them stay. But not everyone in the town shared Jack's compassion. By the 5th day, as Jack prepared to head into town for supplies, Mrs. Henley, the nosy neighbor, caught him on his way out. Her sharp eyes scanned him with judgment as she spoke. A widow, alone with a single man? Unseemly. The town won't approve of this. Jack's face hardened as he listened to her venomous words. They can think what they want, he said flatly, but his mind raced with the consequences. Mrs. Henley was a force in the town, and if she stirred up enough trouble, there was a chance the council might force Grace and Lily to leave. The last thing Jack wanted was to deal with town politics, but he knew it wasn't that simple. When Jack returned home, he found Grace waiting for him in the kitchen, a worried look in her eyes. "What happened?" she asked, noticing the tension in his face. "The town thinks your being here ain't proper," Jack said, his voice rough. "They think you and Lily don't belong." Grace felt her stomach drop. She had already lost so much, and the thought of losing the one thing that kept her going, her daughter, was unbearable. "We'll leave tomorrow," she said, her voice trembling. But just then, something unexpected happened. Lily, who had been silent for days, dropped the dough she had been helping her mother prepare, her little face crumpling with emotion. She ran to the corner of the room and curled up, sobbing quietly. Jack's heart tightened as he watched the scene unfold. He had never seen Lily so vulnerable. Something deep inside him stirred. He couldn't just turn them away, not after everything they had been through. "I didn't say you had to leave," he said, his voice firm. "Town can go to hell." Grace stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to say. The weight of the moment settled over her like a heavy cloak. For the first time since arriving, she felt hope. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, they were safe. That night, as a storm brewed in the distance, Grace knelt beside her bed and whispered a prayer, her voice shaky with emotion. "Please, God, don't let me lose her." Jack, standing by the window, stared out at the dark clouds, the uncertainty of the future pressing down on him. Will Grace and Lily find a home here, or will the town force them out? The storm hit quickly, a sudden rush of cold wind and thick snow that blanketed the ranch in a veil of white. Jack had spent the morning preparing, but now, as the wind howled and the snow swirled around them, there was little more they could do. The visibility was so poor that Grace could hardly make out the barn from the house. Jack grunted, adjusting the collar of his coat as he stepped back inside. "Blizzard warning," he muttered under his breath. "We're stuck here for a while." Grace, already wearing her warmest layers, turned toward him with determination. "I can help. I know storms." Jack looked at her with a raised eyebrow. "This ain't woman's work," he said gruffly. Grace didn't flinch. "I grew up on a farm in Nebraska. I know what to do in a storm," she replied, her voice steady. Jack hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. He knew Grace had a quiet strength about her, and maybe it was time to accept that she wasn't just a guest in his home anymore. She was part of it. It was the first time in weeks that the house had felt like more than a cold, empty place. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth creeping into every corner. For the first time since Rebecca's death, Jack felt the space coming alive again. As the wind howled outside, Jack, Grace, and Lily were all trapped together, and there was nothing to do but wait out the storm. The storm became an unexpected opportunity, a time to finally talk, to reconnect, to fill the silence that had hung over the house like a thick fog for so long. The next morning, the storm raged on, leaving them trapped inside the house with little to do but wait. The hours stretched on in a series of small, intimate moments, cooking together, playing card games by the fire, and telling stories. "Jack," ever the quiet man, found himself teaching Lily how to play cards. She looked up at him, her brown eyes wide with curiosity. "Where's your little girl?" she asked innocently, her voice breaking the tension in the room. Jack's expression hardened for a moment before he answered quietly. "Had a baby coming, but she didn't make it. Neither did my wife." Lily's gaze softened, her small face sympathetic. "Like Samuel," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Grace, who had been watching them closely, felt her heart twist. She had lost so much, her husband, her son, but seeing Jack, broken by his own grief, made her feel less alone. She reached out to him, her hand brushing against his. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Jack looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and gratitude. "Yeah, me too," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. By the third day of the storm, the shift between them was palpable. The tension that had hung between them was replaced with a sense of shared understanding. Jack found Grace sitting in the kitchen, tears streaming down her face as she cooked. She didn't hear him approach, and when he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. "You've been so kind. I don't know how to repay that," Grace said, her voice trembling. Jack shook his head, stepping closer. "You make Lily smile. That's payment enough," he said quietly. Grace paused, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "Why did you really let us stay?" she asked. Jack's face softened, and for the first time, he let down the wall he had built around his heart. "Because when I looked at Lily, I saw what my daughter might have looked like. I couldn't turn you away," he admitted, his voice raw. The storm was finally breaking, but the warmth that had grown between them remained. The days of isolation had softened the hard edges of their grief, replacing them with the fragile beginnings of something new. The intimacy that had developed between them wasn't just physical. It was emotional, a connection forged in shared pain and survival. That night, as they sat by the fire, Grace leaned against Jack's shoulder, her exhaustion evident. She fell asleep there, her breath slow and steady. Jack didn't move, allowing her to rest. He kept the fire going, the warmth wrapping around them both. He didn't know what had changed, but something inside him had shifted. For the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find something to live for again. But as the storm finally cleared, their brief peace was shattered. On the fourth day, just as the sun was setting and the snow began to settle, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. Jack squinted into the fading light and saw Deacon Ferris approaching with Mrs. Henley and a group of council members. His heart sank. The town had come for them. Ferris wasted no time. "We have concerns about your situation," he said, his tone disapproving. Grace, holding Lily close, stepped forward, her heart pounding. She could already feel the weight of their judgment. "Miss Calloway will need to leave by the end of the week," Ferris continued, "or will petition for custody of the girl." Grace's blood ran cold, and she instinctively pulled Lily closer to her, her protective instincts kicking in. "You can't take my daughter," she said, her voice shaking with anger and fear. Ferris didn't flinch. "Unsuitable environments require intervention," he said coldly, his gaze flicking to Jack as if to confirm that Grace's presence at the ranch was a threat to the town's moral fabric. Jack stood frozen for a moment, caught between the obligation to protect his home and the fear of what the town might do. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until Grace turned to him, her eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack looked at her, conflicted. "Town thinks you being here ain't proper," he said quietly. Grace's face went pale, and for the first time since arriving, the reality of their situation sank in. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to fight not just for survival, but for her daughter's safety. "We'll leave tomorrow," she said softly, her voice breaking. Jack's heart twisted in his chest as he saw the fear in her eyes. But then something inside him snapped. "I didn't say you had to leave," he said firmly. "Town can go to hell." Grace looked at him, disbelief in her eyes. She hadn't expected this either. Jack was standing up for them for the first time. That night, as the storm clouds cleared and the stars shone brightly overhead, Grace knelt beside her bed and prayed. Her heart was heavy with fear, but she couldn't let go of the hope that Jack had given her. Jack, standing by the window, looked out at the night sky. His thoughts were jumbled, filled with doubt and uncertainty. But one thing was clear. He couldn't turn them away. Not now, not ever. As the storm clears and the council's threat looms, Grace and Jack face a crossroads. Can they truly make a life together, or will the town tear them apart? Grace's hands trembled as she packed the small leather satchel, the one she had brought with her when she had first arrived at Jack's ranch. The weight of the decision settled heavily on her chest. She had always known that her situation was fragile, that their time here was a temporary reprieve, but the reality of the town's disapproval had shattered any illusion of security. Jack had tried to protect them, but now it seemed inevitable they would have to leave. Her heart broke at the thought of it. What would happen to Lily? What would happen to her? "We'll be okay, baby," she whispered to her daughter, whose face was streaked with tears as she clung to her mother, the silent sorrow in her eyes unspoken but deeply felt. Lily had been through so much already, and now it seemed like she was about to lose the only home she had left. Grace tried to put on a brave face for her daughter, but inside, she was falling apart. Jack's voice echoed in her mind. "Town thinks you being here ain't proper." He had been so conflicted, so torn between what was right and what the town would allow. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. But she couldn't stay here if the town was going to take Lily from her. They were better off leaving. She turned to Lily, forcing a smile. "We'll be all right. We always are." Jack stood in the barn, the weight of his own emotions pressing down on him. He had been staring at his wife's grave all afternoon, lost in his thoughts. Rebecca had been gone for over a year, and yet he could still hear her laugh in his mind, could still feel the warmth of her hand in his. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was betraying her by letting Grace and Lily into his life. It wasn't that he didn't care for them. He did, more than he had expected, but there was still a part of him that felt like he was dishonoring Rebecca's memory. The house had been his with her, and now it was becoming something else, something he wasn't sure he was ready for. He had promised Rebecca that he would never forget her, but now he was faced with the reality of moving on, of opening his heart to someone else. Was he ready for that? Did he even have the right to move forward when the past was still so fresh? He ran a hand through his hair, staring at the empty space around him. "What do I do, Becca?" he whispered into the silence. "Am I betraying you, or am I just too scared to live?" The walk to town was cold and lonely. Grace wrapped Lily tightly in her shawl, clutching her hand as they trudged through the thick snow. The wind bit at their faces, the chill sinking deep into their bones. Grace didn't know what she was looking for, but she knew she had to keep moving. She couldn't stop now, not when there was a chance that she and Lily might be able to find some kind of life outside of this small, judgmental town. Lily's soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Where are we going, Mama?" she asked, her breath fogging in the cold air. Grace looked down at her daughter, her heart breaking. "I don't know yet, sweetheart," she replied softly. "But we'll figure it out." She felt the weight of her words. She wasn't sure where they were going, but she was certain of one thing. They had to keep moving for Lily's sake. They couldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything they had lost. Jack watched them go from the window, a storm of emotions swirling inside him. He couldn't let them leave. He just couldn't. He had promised Rebecca that he would never be alone, that he would never let himself die inside. And that was exactly what he was doing. He was letting them go, just when he had finally begun to feel like there might be something worth living for again. He couldn't make the same mistake that had haunted him for months. He needed Grace. He needed Lily. And if he didn't act now, he would lose them both. Jack saddled his horse and rode through the snow, pushing the animal hard. He wasn't sure if he was running from his own doubts, or if he was running towards something he hadn't yet fully understood. All he knew was that he couldn't let them go without a fight. He had let too much slip through his fingers already. Grace and Lily deserved better than to be cast aside, especially not because of the town's harsh judgment. He wasn't going to let that happen. He was going to fix this. He had to. When Jack reached the stage depot, he saw Grace and Lily standing by the coach, their backs turned to him. Grace was holding Lily in her arms, her posture defeated, her shoulders hunched under the weight of everything she had been carrying. The sight of her, the sadness in her eyes, hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about the town anymore. It was about her, about them. He needed to stop her before she made a decision she couldn't take back. He dismounted and approached them, his heart pounding in his chest. Grace turned when she heard him. "Jack, what are you?" she started, her voice filled with surprise and confusion. "Don't get on that stage," Jack said, his voice firm but gentle. He stepped closer, his breath visible in the cold air. Grace stared at him, unsure of what to make of his words. "We have to, Jack," Grace said, her voice soft but resolute. "You know we do." "No," Jack said, shaking his head. "There's another way. A proper way." Grace's eyes widened in confusion. "Jack, what are you talking about?" The crowd that had gathered behind them fell silent, the weight of the moment sinking in. Jack looked at them, his face hardening. He wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let Grace leave without giving her a chance. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest, and then, without hesitation, he dropped to one knee in the snow. "Grace Calloway," he said, his voice strong, "will you marry me?" The silence that followed was deafening. The world seemed to stop for a moment, the only sound the wind howling in the distance. Grace's eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling as she looked down at him. "Jack, you don't have to do this." "Not for them," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm not doing it for them," Jack replied, his voice firm and steady. "I'm doing it for us. For Lily, because you brought my house back to life. You make me want to be more than surviving." Grace's breath hitched in her chest as she looked at him, her heart torn between the past and the future. "I have nothing to offer you, Jack." "No dowry, no land," she started, but Jack shook his head, cutting her off. "You offer everything that matters," he said, his voice low and sincere. "A home, a family, a reason to keep going." Lily, who had been standing quietly beside her mother, spoke up, her voice soft and hopeful. "Say yes, Mama." Grace looked down at her daughter, then at Jack, her heart swelling with emotion. She knew this was the moment that would change everything. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Jack Thornton, yes." The crowd erupted into applause, and Jack stood, pulling Grace into his arms. They kissed, the world around them fading into the background. In that moment, nothing else mattered. They had found each other. They had found a future. As they made their way back to the ranch, Jack looked at Grace, his heart full. "Did you mean what you said?" she asked, her voice soft with uncertainty. "About me bringing your house to life?" "Every word," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. Grace smiled, though it was tinged with fear. "I'm scared, Jack. What if I can't be what you need?" Jack reached out, taking her hand in his. "You already are," he said, his voice full of quiet conviction. As they rode home, the storm clouds cleared, and for the first time in months, the world seemed full of possibilities. With their future uncertain, Grace and Jack faced the challenges of building a life together. Will their marriage of convenience become something real? The small church was filled with a warm glow of candlelight, but the atmosphere was anything but festive. Grace stood in front of the altar, wearing the only dress she had, a simple, mended garment that now held the weight of her past, present, and future. Jack stood beside her, his Sunday best hanging awkwardly on his broad shoulders, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the edge of the pew. Lily, looking too small in a borrowed flower girl dress, beamed up at Grace, her eyes filled with excitement despite the uncertainty that surrounded them. It was a quiet, intimate ceremony, and yet it felt like the entire town was watching from the shadows. Deacon Ferris, who had reluctantly agreed to marry them, cleared his throat and began the ceremony, his voice cold but steady. As Jack said, "I do," there was a weight to his words, an authenticity that Grace could feel in the depths of her heart. She had known from the moment he had kneeled in the snow and proposed that he was not doing it out of obligation or pity, but out of love, something she had long since given up hope of ever finding again. As they exchanged vows, something inside Grace shifted. She wasn't just marrying Jack to survive anymore. She was marrying him because she wanted to, because despite the odds, he had become her reason to hope again. After the ceremony, they made their way back to the ranch. There was a quiet awkwardness between them. Grace had expected the wedding to be the hard part, the part where everything would change, and they would become something they hadn't been before. But now that it was over, she realized that the real change was not in the ceremony or the title. It was in the way they were going to live together, how they would build their life, their family, and their home. "I'll still sleep in a barn unless you want." Grace trailed off as she sat down at the kitchen table, unsure how to finish her thought. Jack looked at her, his brow furrowed. "You're my wife now. The house is yours. I'll take the barn," he said simply. It wasn't the romantic gesture Grace had imagined. It wasn't what she had expected, but it was real. And in that moment, it felt like a start, not an end. "This is your home now, too, Jack," she replied softly, her voice full of both nervousness and hope. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic shift, just the quiet understanding that they were trying to make something work. That night, they both retired to their separate rooms. There was an unspoken agreement that they needed time, that this was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Grace found herself signing Grace Thornton for the first time, a small but significant milestone in her new life. It was a name she had never expected to use again, a name she had thought she would never feel comfortable carrying. But there was something about the way Jack said her name, the way he looked at her when she wrote it down, that made it feel like she was becoming part of something larger, something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in for a long time. Meanwhile, Lily began to warm to Jack in small but telling ways. She was still tentative, still unsure, but every now and then she would call him Papa Jack, and Jack's eyes would fill with tears. It wasn't much, but it was progress. They worked together, Jack teaching Grace about ranching, and Grace teaching Jack the art of cooking. There were small moments of connection. Jack's rough hands learning to braid Lily's hair, Grace quietly fixing Jack's collar when it got crooked, their shared laughter over simple things. In those moments, the awkwardness started to fade, replaced by the slow but sure realization that they were becoming a family, little by little. But no new life is without its challenges. A few weeks after their marriage, they had their first fight. It wasn't anything big, but it was enough to rattle them both. Jack had made a decision about the cattle without consulting Grace, and when she found out, she felt a pang of betrayal. "I thought we were partners," she said, her voice tight with hurt. Jack, taken aback, snapped back, "I need to ask permission now." The words stung more than either of them expected. There was a moment of silence, the kind that hung between them like a fog, thick and heavy. Grace was the first to break it. "I don't need permission, but I thought we were in this together," she said, her voice softer now, but still laced with pain. Jack's face softened as he realized what he had done. He hadn't meant to treat her like an employee, but in that moment, that's exactly how he had. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I wasn't thinking. I'm not used to sharing decisions. But I'm learning. We're learning." Grace nodded, her eyes searching his. "So am I," she said. "But we have to try. We have to be partners." Jack reached for her hand, and for the first time since their wedding, he pulled her into a hug, his arms tight around her. "We'll figure it out," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. As the weeks passed, their connection deepened. Spring began to take root on the ranch, and with it, a new sense of life and possibility. Jack and Grace found themselves stealing moments of closeness, small touches, lingering glances, quiet smiles that spoke volumes. Jack, who had been closed off for so long, found himself watching Grace more than he intended. One evening, as she washed clothes, her hair had come loose from its braid, and Jack caught himself staring at the way the strands framed her face. He quickly turned away, but it didn't go unnoticed. Grace had seen the way he looked at her, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that something was changing, that they were no longer just surviving, but living. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, the house quiet except for the sound of the wind, Grace looked over at Jack. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice full of gratitude, "for giving us a home." Jack smiled, his heart swelling. "Thank you," he replied, his voice thick with emotion, "for making it a family." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his hand lingering against her skin. The touch was gentle, but it was enough. The tension between them, the uncertainty that had lingered since the beginning, was finally beginning to fade. And then, as the night settled around them, Jack leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't the fierce kiss of someone desperate, but the gentle kiss of someone learning to love again, someone who had been closed off for too long and was finally ready to open his heart. Grace pulled back after a moment, her breath shaky. "I didn't think I'd feel this way again," she whispered, her eyes wide with vulnerability. Jack smiled softly, his hand resting on her cheek. "Me neither," he said, his voice hushed. "But it's okay. It's all okay." The kiss was just the beginning. As they began to navigate their new life together, it became clear that something deeper was forming between them, something real, something that went beyond their marriage of convenience. They were building a life, slowly, carefully, but with intention. And in that quiet, tender moment, both of them knew that they were no longer just surviving. They were living. With spring in full swing and their love blossoming, Jack and Grace faced the next challenge. Can their growing bond withstand the complexities of their new life? Or will the outside world threaten to tear them apart? The morning after their first real kiss was a quiet one. Grace awoke to the soft sound of birds chirping outside the window and the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven. Jack was already up, his boots crunching on the snow outside as he worked on the ranch. Grace stretched, feeling the warmth of the covers and the warmth of Jack's love in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. She had always been guarded, always kept a part of herself locked away, but that kiss had opened something inside her. It was as if a door had finally been unlocked, allowing her to believe that love, real love, was possible again. Her heart was lighter than it had been in years, and for the first time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could trust this new beginning. Jack had been patient with her, never rushing her, always giving her space to heal. But the space between them had begun to close, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before the love that had been growing between them would bloom into something more. The uncertainty of the past seemed to fade as the days went on, and with it, her fears about their future. They were becoming a family in every sense of the word, and despite the awkwardness that had marked their early days together, Grace had found herself genuinely looking forward to the life they were building. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. The ranch was thriving now. The cattle were healthy, the crops were growing, and the house, once cold and lifeless, was full of warmth and love. Grace had found her rhythm in the kitchen, baking bread and cooking meals that Jack and Lily devoured with enthusiasm. Jack, in turn, had taught her how to care for the animals, how to work the land, how to make the most of what they had. It was hard work, but it was rewarding, and the sense of accomplishment they shared after each task was completed made the long hours worth it. Lily, too, had blossomed. She had gained weight, her cheeks rounder, her laughter filling the house more and more each day. She had made friends at the small school in town, and each evening she would rush home to share the stories of her day. Her eyes sparkled with life again, and Grace couldn't help but feel grateful for the second chance they had been given. But not everyone in the town was so welcoming. Mrs. Henley, ever the gossip, had made it her mission to stir the pot, to spread rumors about Grace and Jack's marriage. The whispers had started to pick up again, and Grace couldn't escape the sting of the judgment that followed her everywhere she went. Gold digger, they called her. After his land, not his heart. Grace had tried to ignore the hurtful words, but it was difficult. She had grown up in a small town, and she knew how quickly rumors could spread. The whispers were relentless, and it felt as though every step she took was weighed down by the heavy burden of their scrutiny. She wasn't sure if she could take much more of it. The judgment wasn't just about her. It was about Lily, too. They saw her as an outsider, someone who didn't belong, someone who was only there because she had nowhere else to go. And that hurt. It hurt more than Grace was willing to admit. She had always fought for her survival, but now she was fighting for her family's place in the world. One day, while Grace was at the mercantile with Lily, she overheard a conversation between two women. Their words cut deep, each one sharper than the last. Poor Jack, saddled with another man's child, one woman said, her voice dripping with disdain. She's just using him for his land, you know. The other woman nodded. Gold digger. She'll have him wrapped around her finger soon enough. Mark my words, she's after something much bigger than his heart. Grace stood frozen, her blood running cold as she listened to their cruel words. Lily, sensing the change in her mother's demeanor, looked up at her, her small hand slipping into Grace's. Mama, why are they being mean? Lily asked, her innocent voice breaking Grace's heart. Grace forced a smile, though it was shaky at best. People who aren't happy try to make others unhappy, she said, her voice quiet but firm. She didn't want Lily to see how deeply the words had affected her, but they had. They had hurt more than she cared to admit. It was one thing to endure the harshness of strangers, but it was another to have the town's judgment hanging over her head like a dark cloud. Later that evening, Jack came home to find Grace quieter than usual. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap as she stared into the fire. Jack's heart ached when he saw the sorrow in her eyes. What's wrong? He asked, sitting down beside her. Grace didn't answer right away. She had always been the strong one, the one who kept it together no matter what. But now, the cracks in her armor were showing. Maybe they're right, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe I did trap you. Jack's chest tightened as he listened to her words. He had never seen her like this before, vulnerable, unsure. He reached for her hand, holding it gently in his. That's nonsense, Grace, he said, his voice low and steady. You didn't trap me. You saved me. Grace looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. Is it Jack? Is it nonsense? She asked, her voice trembling. You gave up your freedom, your chance at real love, because you felt sorry for us. Jack's heart broke as he looked at her, seeing the pain she had been hiding for so long. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that streaked down her cheeks. I love you, Grace, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I should have said it before. I love you. Not out of duty, not out of pity, but because you're the one who pulled me out of the dark. You brought joy back into my life. You made me want to live again. Grace's sobs broke free, her body shaking with the release of everything she had been holding inside. I love you too, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. So much it terrifies me. Jack kissed her gently, his lips tender against hers. Then let's be terrified together, he whispered, pulling her close. The next day, Jack stood in front of the entire town at the mandatory church social. Mrs. Henley had made another snide remark about Grace, and Jack could no longer stay silent. He stood abruptly, drawing everyone's attention. I've got something to say, he began, his voice steady but full of conviction. My wife, Grace, is the finest woman I've ever known. She saved my life when I was drowning. She brought joy back to my home and love back to my heart. Anyone here got a problem with that can take it up with me outside. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. Tom Wheeler, the grizzled rancher, stood up next, his voice loud and firm. Jack's right. We should be celebrating them, not tearing them down. One by one, others stood up to support Grace and Jack. Even Deacon Ferris nodded grudgingly, his face softer than before. Grace stood beside Jack, her heart swelling with gratitude for the support they had received. For the first time, it felt like they were truly part of the community. As they walked home later that evening, Lily between them, Grace looked up at Jack with a new sense of peace. "Are the mean people gone now?" Lily asked innocently. Jack smiled down at her. "Most of them, little bird," he said softly. Grace looked at Jack, a small smile playing on her lips. "We're really going to make it, aren't we?" she asked, her voice filled with hope. Jack squeezed her hand, his voice confident. "We already are." But then, as they walked through the quiet night, Grace stumbled slightly. Jack caught her before she could fall, concern flashing in his eyes. "You feeling okay?" he asked, his voice full of worry. Grace gave him a mysterious smile. "I'll tell you when I'm sure," she said softly, her hand resting against her stomach. What is Grace keeping secret? Is there more to their journey than either of them could have expected? The early summer evening sun cast a soft golden hue over the Thornton Ranch, the fields blooming with new life. Grace stood in the kitchen, the familiar scent of baking bread filling the air, her hands moving instinctively as she worked. Jack had just come in from the fields, his shirt damp from the sweat of a long day's work, but his face lit up when he saw her. Lily, now nearly 7, was playing outside with the corn husk dolls Grace had made for her, laughing as she chased after the fireflies that danced in the evening light. The sound of her laughter filled the house, a sound that had become more common these days, replacing the silence that had once dominated their lives. Grace's heart swelled with love as she watched her daughter, but there was something else growing inside her too, a new life, a new hope, a new beginning. She had known for a while, but she had kept it to herself, unsure of how to share it, how to tell Jack. Now, though, she felt the time had come. Her heart raced as she moved towards him, her hands gently resting on her growing belly. She took Jack's hand and placed it there, the warmth of his touch sending a thrill through her. "Jack," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly with excitement and fear, "I'm pregnant." Jack's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. His heart leaped in his chest as he processed the news. "Grace," he whispered, a mixture of awe and joy in his voice. Are you sure?" Grace nodded, her tears welling up as she looked at him. "Yes, I'm sure. I'm pregnant, Jack." Before Jack could say anything more, the sound of Lily's excited shriek interrupted them. She had heard them talking and had come running, her eyes wide with excitement. "Mama, are you going to have a baby?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. Grace laughed, wiping away her tears. "Yes, sweetheart, you're going to be a big sister." Lily's face broke into a huge grin, her hands clapping together in joy. "I'm going to be a big sister," she shouted, running around in circles. Jack laughed, his heart bursting with love for both of them. This was what he had wanted, what he had dreamed of, a family. He pulled Grace into a tight embrace, his arms enveloping her as they shared this new, beautiful moment together. "I'm terrified," he whispered into her hair, "but I'm happier than I've ever been." Grace smiled, her heart full. "We'll be all right," she said softly, "together." The next day, Grace and Lily took a trip to the cemetery where Thomas was buried. The air was crisp, and the ground was soft beneath their feet as they walked together. Lily had picked wildflowers from the meadow, holding them in her small hands as they approached Thomas's grave. "Should we tell Papa Thomas about the baby?" Lily asked, looking up at Grace with wide, innocent eyes. Grace knelt beside her daughter, gently placing the flowers on Thomas's grave. "I think he already knows, sweetheart," Grace said quietly, her heart aching with the memories of the man she had loved. "And I think he's happy for us." Lily smiled and nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "Do you still love him, Mama?" she asked, her voice small. Grace took a deep breath, the question stirring old emotions within her. "Always," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to fall. "I'll always love you, Papa Thomas. But love doesn't run out, sweetheart. I love Papa Jack, too. Different, but just as real." Lily smiled, her small hands reaching up to hold Grace's. "Like I love you and Papa Jack?" she asked, her voice filled with clarity. Grace smiled through her tears, her heart full. "Exactly like that," she said, kissing her daughter's forehead. Later that day, Jack made a quiet visit to Rebecca's grave. He stood there for a long time, the weight of his emotions pressing down on him. He had loved Rebecca with all his heart, and losing her had nearly broken him. But now, standing at her grave, he felt a sense of peace. He spoke softly to her, as if she could hear him. "I've got news, Becca," he whispered, placing a fresh bouquet of flowers on her grave. "Grace is expecting. We're going to have a baby." His voice cracked slightly as he continued. "I'm scared out of my mind, but I think this time it'll be different. Grace is strong, and we've got the doctor on call. I've got something to live for now, and I think you'll be happy for us. Thank you for the years we had, for teaching me how to love. I'm using those lessons to love her, to love our family." He stood there for a moment longer, feeling the wind through the trees, and he swore he could almost feel Rebecca's presence beside him. It was as if she was giving her blessing. The town, once so hostile, had begun to change its tune. The women of the community rallied around Grace, offering their support and guidance as her belly grew. Mrs. Wheeler, the kind-hearted rancher's wife, insisted on throwing Grace a baby shower, despite Grace's protests. "You don't have to," Grace said, her voice overwhelmed by the kindness of it all. "Yes, we do," Mrs. Wheeler said firmly, her hands on her hips. "You're one of us now. This is what we do." The women came together, bringing baby clothes, homemade blankets, and advice. Even the men in the town, including Tom Wheeler and the other ranchers, had begun to warm up to Grace and Jack, offering congratulations and support. The harsh whispers that had followed Grace and Lily when they first arrived had faded, replaced by a sense of community and belonging. The day of the baby shower arrived, and the Thornton Ranch was alive with the sounds of laughter and chatter. The barn was decorated with ribbons and flowers, and tables laden with food filled the space. Grace stood at the center of it all, surrounded by the women who had once been so suspicious of her. But now, they were her friends, her family, and she felt their love and support like a warm embrace. Jack stood with the men outside, nervously accepting congratulations and well wishes, his hand resting on his growing belly. He had never imagined his life would look like this, so full, so rich with love. But here he was, and it felt right. Months passed, and the day of Grace's labor finally arrived. It was a hard, difficult labor, but Grace was strong. Jack stayed by her side the entire time, his hand in hers, his voice steady and comforting. "You're doing amazing," he whispered over and over. "We didn't come this far to stop now." Grace, exhausted and in pain, smiled weakly. "I can't," she gasped. "I can't do it." Jack leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "Yes, you can. I'm right here. We're in this together." And with that, Grace found the strength she needed. Hours later, after what felt like an eternity, the cry of their baby filled the room. It was a girl, perfect and healthy, and Jack broke down in tears as he held her for the first time. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "You're perfect." They named her Rebecca Grace Thornton, a tribute to both of the women who had shaped their lives, Grace, who had given him the strength to live again, and Rebecca, whose memory would always live on in their hearts. Lily, who had been anxiously waiting in the kitchen with Tom Wheeler, rushed in to meet her new sister. "She's so tiny," Lily whispered, awe in her voice. "What's her name?" Grace looked at Jack, and they both smiled. "Rebecca Grace Thornton," Grace said, her voice full of love and gratitude. As the months passed, life on the ranch became even more fulfilling. They were a family now, complete. The town had embraced them fully, and they had built a life that was theirs. The Thornton Ranch had flourished, and Grace and Jack had built something beautiful, something worth every hardship they had faced. 1 year later, the anniversary of their marriage arrived. The barn was full of guests, the dance floor alive with music and laughter. The community had come together to celebrate their love, their family. As Grace stood beside Jack, watching their daughters play in the yard, she couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. "Hard to believe where we were 2 years ago," Jack said softly, his voice filled with wonder. "You mean when I showed up with nothing but my daughter and desperation?" Grace asked with a smile. Jack nodded, his arm around her. "And I was too stubborn and scared to see the gift right in front of me." Grace smiled, her heart full. "We both were scared." Jack kissed the top of her head. "Not anymore." Lily ran up to them, breathless from chasing fireflies. "Mama, Papa, remember when we walked in the snow and didn't know where we'd go?" she asked, her voice full of innocence. Grace knelt down to her level, her smile wide. "I remember, sweetheart," she said softly. "I'm glad we found Papa Jack," Lily said, her eyes full of love. Jack smiled, pulling Lily into his arms. "I'm glad you found me," he said, holding her tightly. Grace looked at her family, her 2 daughters, her husband, and smiled. "We found each other," and that made all the difference. As the evening came to a close, Grace rocked baby Rebecca to sleep. Lily curled up beside Jack on the couch. The house was full of warmth, love, and laughter. And for the first time in years, Grace felt at peace. She had been left with nothing but her daughter. But now she had everything. Her family, her home, her love. And together they had built something beautiful. Grace Calloway Thornton looked around her warm kitchen, at her daughters, her husband, her home, and remembered the woman who had stood in the snow with nothing but her child and a prayer. That woman had been desperate, terrified, alone. This woman was loved, secure, whole. She was left with nothing but her daughter until a cowboy gave her his name, his home, and his heart. And together, they built something neither could have built alone, a family, a life, a love worth every hardship they'd endured to find it. "That's what home is," Grace whispered, watching her family. "Not a place, but the people who fill it with love.